Welcome to a short video to explain the Desmos activity on domain and range. In this Desmos activity, we're going to further explore the concepts of domain and range of a function. If you need a quick review of this, it probably would be helpful if you went back and watched media example problem 17 from the textbook. There is a link in the activity to help you with that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to work with a graph that has a shaded region that represents either the domain or the range of a given function. An endpoint that is not included in the interval will be represented by an open dot at the end of the graph and a dashed line delimiting the region. If the endpoint is included in the interval, then we're going to use a closed dot at the end of the graph and a solid line delimiting the region. So if you look in the video that you're watching right now, you'll see an example graph where we talk about domain. So it says, look at this example graph and write the interval of the domain in inequality notation, interval notation, and then consider the shaded region. So let's go ahead and do that. I've got it separated out here for us so we can take a look at it. So how do we determine the domain and the range from this graph? Well, the easiest way to do that is going to be to take a look first off, of course, at the endpoints, because we're going to need to know those. And we notice here that this endpoint right here, that endpoint is an open dot. And since that's an open dot, that means the endpoint is not included. So if the endpoint is not included, then that means we can go up to but not include that particular point. If I can spell include, that would be helpful, right? So endpoint not included. All right. So that means that from the right hand side here, that we can get as close as we want to 4, but we don't get to 4. So the x values come right up to 4, but they don't include it. The left endpoint over here, back down here at 1 though, that is a closed endpoint. And so since that's closed, that means the endpoint is included. So we include this time. All right, so what does that mean with respect to our actual inequality and interval notation? Well, a good way to think about this is to come back and shade this interval onto the x-axis, and now it represents what you may be more familiar with, which is a number line graph of your inequality. So I'm going to put an open dot here, I'm going to put a closed dot here, and it's everything in between those two values. So what that means in terms of the inequality notation is that our value of x is strictly less than 4, but it's greater than or equal to 1. It's trapped between those two numbers. Well, similarly, we can do our interval notation that way. So remember, this value right here is 1. So what we see is that our endpoint 1 is included, so we'll put a bracket there. Our endpoint 4 is not included, so we'll put a parenthesis there. Okay, now similar idea with range. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example of range. So in this graph, the blue shaded region represents the region of where we have y values, or the range of our function. Notice up here that we have an endpoint that is not included, so that this endpoint is open, which means that endpoint is not included. And down here we have an endpoint that is closed, which means that endpoint is included. And correspondingly on both the previous graph and this one is that we see here that this was a dashed line and a solid line respectively. Okay, so how do we determine what the range is? Well, notice that we shaded on the x-axis for the domain, so the range is going to be shaded on the y-axis. So what we know is that our range starts down here. We have a closed point down here at -3, and then it goes all the way up to +3, but that endpoint is not included, so we put an open dot there. And then we shade this region right here, and that shaded region represents our range. Now, many students have a difficult time seeing that in a vertical fashion. So what we can do is take the y-axis and just lay it on its side here, okay? So this is still a y-axis, but we'll lay it down. And now we've got a closed dot down here at -3, and we've got an open dot up here at +3. And notice that it's everything in between those two values, right? So what that tells us is that -3 is less than or equal to y, which is strictly less than +3. Or in interval notation, that would be bracket -3 to positive 3 with a parenthesis on the open end. Well, hopefully that helps you get started into the Desmos activity. If you need additional help, please do not be shy about posting either to the Q&A forum or sending me a message, and I will get back to you as promptly as possible.